The morning of March 17th, 1943, broke cold and grey over the airfield at Halesworth, England. Captain Michael Brennan stood on the rain-slicked tarmac, watching the ground crews prepare his P-38 Lightning for what would become the most critical mission of his military career. The twin-engine fighter gleamed dully in the weak sunlight breaking through the clouds, its distinctive twin-boom design cutting a sharp silhouette against the overcast sky. At 24 years old, with 72 combat missions already logged, Brennan had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled pilots in the 8th Air Force, but nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what the next 90 minutes would demand of him. The briefing had been straightforward enough. 5 B-17 flying fortresses, each carrying a full payload of 500-pound bombs, were scheduled to strike a critical ball bearing factory deep in German-occupied territory. Intelligence reports indicated minimal fighter presence along the planned route, making it what commanders optimistically called a milk run. But Brennan had learned never to trust intelligence reports completely. The Luftwaffe had proven time and again their ability to appear exactly where they were least expected, and today something in his gut told him this mission would be different. Before we continue with Captain Brennan's incredible story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more remarkable true stories from history to life. The bombers lifted off first, their heavy frames struggling against gravity as they climbed into formation. Brennan watched them disappear into the cloud layer before starting his own pre-flight check. His crew chief, Sergeant Thomas Riley, a weathered veteran from Oklahoma with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, walked around the aircraft one final time, checking every panel, every rivet, every connection that might mean the difference between life and death at 20,000 feet. Riley had been with Brennan since his arrival in England 8 months earlier. The two men had developed the kind of wordless understanding that comes only from shared experience and mutual respect. Riley knew Brennan pushed the Lightning to its absolute limits, demanding performance that sometimes seemed impossible from the aircraft. In return, Brennan trusted Riley's mechanical genius implicitly. If Riley said the plane was ready, it was ready. Climbing into the cramped cockpit, Brennan went through his startup sequence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same ritual hundreds of times. The twin Allison engines coughed to life, their 12 cylinders settling into a powerful rhythm that he could feel through the control stick. He adjusted his oxygen mask, checked his instruments one final time, and released the brakes. The Lightning accelerated down the runway, gathering speed until the nose lifted, and England fell away beneath him. The climb to altitude took 20 minutes. Brennan throttled back to conserve fuel, knowing that escort duty required careful management of every drop of gasoline in his tanks. At 18,000 feet, he broke through the cloud layer into brilliant sunshine. The world below disappeared into a sea of white, and ahead of him, the 5 bombers appeared as dark silhouettes against the endless blue sky. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson commanded the bomber formation from the lead aircraft. Patterson was 41, ancient by combat pilot standards, a veteran of the First World War who had volunteered to return to service after Pearl Harbor. His hands bore the scars of a crash landing in France 25 years earlier, and his left knee ached in cold weather from shrapnel that French surgeons had never completely removed. But his mind remained sharp, his judgment sound, and his determination to complete every mission absolute. Patterson's bombardier, First Lieutenant David Chen, was the son of Chinese immigrants who had settled in San Francisco before the war. Chen had graduated top of his class from bombardier school, possessing an almost supernatural ability to calculate wind drift, altitude corrections, and lead times in his head faster than most men could work them out with instruments. His precision had made Patterson's crew one of the most effective in the entire bomber group. The formation droned eastward, crossing the English coast near Great Yarmouth. The North Sea stretched beneath them, grey and forbidding, its surface churned by winds that created whitecaps, visible even from their altitude. Brennan took up position slightly above and behind the bombers, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for any sign of enemy fighters. The radio crackled with occasional position reports, weather updates, and the mundane chatter that helped crews stay alert during long flights over hostile territory. They crossed into occupied Holland 2 hours after takeoff. Below, the patchwork of flooded fields and damaged dikes bore witness to the deliberate flooding the Germans had ordered to prevent Allied landings. Small towns and villages appeared as clusters of red roofs amid the destruction, their inhabitants living under occupation, hoping for liberation that seemed to recede further with each passing month. Patterson checked his charts, comparing landmarks visible through breaks in the clouds with his planned route. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan. Too exactly, he thought with a flicker of unease. In his experience, missions that went too smoothly usually ended badly. He increased his vigilance, knowing that complacency killed more airmen than enemy action. The German radar stations had picked up the formation 10 minutes after they crossed the Dutch coast. At a Luftwaffe base near Münster, Major Klaus Richter received the alert with grim satisfaction. Richter commanded a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s, single-engine fighters, renowned for their speed, firepower, and durability. At 32, Richter had flown combat missions in Poland, France, and Russia, accumulating 47 confirmed kills that made him one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilots. Richter studied the plotboard showing the bomber formation's trajectory. The Americans were heading toward Schweinfurt, he concluded, targeting the ball-bearing factories that supplied critical components to German industry. He made his decision quickly, as he always did. 12 fighters would scramble immediately, climbing to altitude to intercept the bombers before they reached their target. The Americans would have escorts, certainly, but Richter had learned that American fighter pilots, though brave and well-trained, often lacked the tactical sophistication of their German counterparts. This would be another successful interception, another group of bombers that would never complete their mission. Brennan saw them first, sunlight glinting off canopies as the German fighters climbed through 20,000 feet, still 5 miles distant, but closing fast. His pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He keyed his radio, his voice calm and measured, despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through his system. "Captain Michael Brennan to bomber formation, 12 bandits, 3 o'clock high, closing fast. I'm engaging." Patterson acknowledged the transmission, his own voice betraying no emotion. His gunners were already swiveling their weapons, tracking the approaching fighters. Patterson knew the mathematics of aerial combat with brutal clarity. 12 German fighters against 5 bombers and 1 escort meant his formation was badly outnumbered. Everything now depended on Brennan's skill and the discipline of his bomber crews. Brennan pushed the Lightning into a steep climbing turn, trading altitude for speed as he positioned himself between the bombers and the approaching threat. The German fighters were in a loose formation, standard Luftwaffe tactics designed to give each pilot freedom to maneuver while maintaining mutual support. Richter led the formation, his experienced eye already assessing the tactical situation. 1 American fighter against 12. The odds were absurdly in his favor. But Richter had not survived 3 years of combat by underestimating his opponents. He studied the lone Lightning, noting how it positioned itself with geometric precision, how it maintained energy rather than simply charging forward. This American pilot knew what he was doing. Richter adjusted his own approach, signaling his wingmen to spread out, to force the American to divide his attention. The first pass happened at a combined speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. Brennan rolled inverted, diving beneath Richter's line of flight, then pulled hard into a vertical climb that brought him up behind the German formation. His thumb found the firing button, and the Lightning's 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon opened fire in a devastating burst. Tracer rounds stitched across the tail of one Focke-Wulf, tearing through control surfaces and sending the German fighter into a violent spin. 1 down, 11 to go. Richter cursed in German, impressed despite himself by the Americans' gunnery. The Lightning had appeared exactly where Richter had not expected it, had fired with precision, and had already rolled away before Richter's wingman could bring his own guns to bear. This pilot was exceptional, far better than the average American fighter jock. Richter barked orders to his remaining fighters, directing them to split into 2 groups. They would attack the bombers from multiple angles, forcing the American to choose which group to engage. Whichever bombers he left unprotected would be destroyed. Brennan saw the German formation split and immediately understood Richter's strategy. He had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether those 5 bomber crews lived or died. His mind raced through the tactical geometry, calculating angles, speeds, and distances with the same mathematical precision that Chen applied to bombing runs. Then he saw it, the single move that might work, that had to work. He rolled the Lightning hard left, pushing the throttles to their stops. The twin Allisons screamed, pouring every ounce of available power into the propellers. The Lightning accelerated toward the northern group of German fighters, appearing to commit fully to engaging them. Richter smiled grimly. The American had made his choice. The southern group would now have clear shots at the bombers. But Brennan had no intention of engaging the northern group. At the last possible second, he pulled into a violent snap roll that reversed his direction, simultaneously diving to pick up even more speed. The maneuver subjected him to forces that grayed his vision and pressed him hard into his seat. But when he leveled out, he had positioned himself perfectly between the southern group of German fighters and the vulnerable bombers. This time, his gunnery was even more precise. 2 Focke-Wulfs disintegrated under his fire, their fuel tanks exploding in orange fireballs that briefly outshone the sun. Fragments of aircraft rained down toward the earth below, carrying with them 2 German pilots who would never return home. 3 down, 9 remaining. Richter realized he had been outmaneuvered by a master tactician. This American pilot was not merely skilled, he was brilliant, reading the tactical situation several moves ahead, like a chess grandmaster. Richter keyed his radio, ordering all remaining fighters to converge on the Lightning. They would ignore the bombers temporarily, focusing every weapon on destroying this single pilot who had already cost him 3 aircraft and 3 experienced pilots in less than 2 minutes. Brennan found himself suddenly surrounded by German fighters, all converging on his position from different angles. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds filled the air around him, creating a deadly crossfire from which there seemed no escape. He threw the Lightning into a series of violent maneuvers, rolling, diving, climbing, skidding sideways through the air in ways that pushed the aircraft beyond its design specifications. Metal stressed and groaned under forces it was never meant to endure. Riley's meticulous maintenance work was all that kept the Lightning intact as Brennan demanded the impossible from every component, every system. A 20mm shell punched through the Lightning's left boom, missing the engine by inches. Shrapnel peppered the cockpit, and Brennan felt a sharp sting in his left shoulder where a fragment had penetrated his flight suit. Warm blood began to soak into the fabric, but he ignored the pain, his focus absolute on keeping the German fighters away from the bombers. Patterson watched the fight developing above and behind his formation with a mixture of awe and horror. The single American fighter was taking on 9 German planes simultaneously, outflying pilots who had been in combat since the war's beginning. But Patterson could see that Brennan was bleeding energy, trading speed and altitude for position with each defensive maneuver. The laws of physics were inexorable. Eventually, Brennan would run out of options. Then Patterson made a decision that violated every regulation, every protocol, every rule of bomber formation tactics. He broke from the formation, pulling his B-17 into a steep climbing turn that brought him toward the furball of German fighters. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes, stared at Patterson in disbelief. "Colonel, what are you doing? We can't fight fighters in a bomber." Patterson's jaw set in a hard line. "That pilot up there is dying to protect us. We're going to help him." Hayes understood instantly. He began calling out targets to the gunners, directing their fire toward the German fighters nearest to Brennan's Lightning. The B-17's 50 caliber machine guns opened up, not expecting to hit the nimble fighters, but creating a new threat that forced them to divide their attention. Richter saw the bomber climbing toward the fight and recognized immediately what the American commander was attempting. It was tactically insane, strategically brilliant, and operationally unexpected. The bomber could never catch the fighters, but its guns created zones of fire that complicated every attack run. Richter found himself forced to maneuver defensively, to think about threats from below as well as from the lightning that continued to snap and roll through the air like a thing possessed. Brennan saw Patterson's bomber climbing toward the fight and felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. The bomber crew was putting themselves at enormous risk, but their intervention had bought him precious seconds to reposition, to regain some of the energy he had bled away. He used those seconds ruthlessly, climbing back above the German fighters, regaining the altitude advantage that meant life or death in air combat. The fourth German fighter fell to a deflection shot that Brennan fired while inverted, his aircraft hanging from its propellers as he tracked the Focke-Wulf through a turn. The fifth died when it made the fatal mistake of trying to follow the Lightning through a high-speed spiral, stalling out at the top and presenting an impossible-to-miss target. 5 down, 7 remaining. Richter looked at his fuel gauge and felt cold calculation override his anger. They were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, and the Americans had not even reached their target yet. If they continued this fight, none of his fighters would have enough fuel to return to base. The tactical situation had become untenable. With enormous reluctance, Richter gave the order to disengage. The German fighters broke off, diving away toward the east. Brennan wanted to pursue, to press his advantage, but his own fuel situation was critical. He had been running at maximum power for nearly 20 minutes, consuming gasoline at rates far above normal cruising consumption. He throttled back, allowing his engines to cool, and took stock of the damage to his aircraft. The hole in his left boom worried him. He could see daylight through torn metal, and the entire structure vibrated in ways it should not. His left shoulder throbbed where shrapnel had torn through muscle, and his instruments showed damage to several systems. But the Lightning still flew, still responded to his controls. Riley's maintenance work had saved his life. Patterson brought his bomber back into formation, his crew cheering despite their exposed position. Patterson keyed his radio, his voice rough with emotion. "That was the finest piece of flying I have ever witnessed, Captain. You saved our lives." Brennan's response was characteristically modest. "Just doing my job, Colonel. Let us finish this mission." The formation continued eastward. The target appeared ahead, the ball-bearing factory complex sprawling across several city blocks, smoke rising from its chimneys as workers inside produced the precision components that kept German tanks, aircraft, and weapons systems operational. Jen hunched over his bomb site, making minute adjustments for wind and altitude, his calculations proceeding with mechanical precision. The bomb bay doors opened with a mechanical rumble. Chen tracked the target through his sight, waiting for the perfect moment when geometry, physics, and timing aligned. His finger pressed the release, and 5 tons of high explosive fell away from Patterson's bomber. The other 4 B-17s released simultaneously, their bombardiers following Chen's lead. Brennan watched the bombs fall, watched them disappear into the smoke and haze below, watched the factory complex erupt in a series of massive explosions that sent debris hundreds of feet into the air. Secondary explosions rippled through the facility as stored materials ignited, creating a firestorm visible for miles. The mission objective had been achieved. The return flight tested Brennan's endurance to its limits. His shoulder injury had stiffened, making it difficult to move his left arm. Blood loss left him lightheaded and fighting to maintain concentration. The damaged lightning vibrated continuously, each tremor a reminder that catastrophic structural failure could occur at any moment. But he stayed with the bombers, shepherding them back across Germany, across Holland, across the North Sea to England. Riley was waiting when Brennan finally coaxed the battered Lightning onto the runway at Halesworth. The crew chief took one look at the damaged aircraft and the blood-soaked pilot, climbing stiffly from the cockpit, and immediately called for medics. Brennan waved them off, insisting on walking to debriefing under his own power. Pride and stubbornness kept him upright until he collapsed just inside the briefing room, his body finally acknowledging the trauma it had endured. He woke in the base hospital 12 hours later. Patterson sat beside his bed, the older man's weathered face creased with concern. When Brennan's eyes opened, Patterson smiled. "Welcome back, Captain. You gave us quite a scare." Brennan's throat was dry, his voice hoarse. "The other crews, they all made it back?" Patterson nodded. "All 5 bombers returned safely. 35 men owe their lives to you and your aircraft. The intelligence boys are already analyzing the gun camera footage from your Lightning. They confirm 5 German fighters destroyed, 5 kills in 90 minutes while protecting 5 bombers against overwhelming odds. It is unprecedented." Brennan tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his shoulder, and settled back against the pillows. "I was just doing what needed to be done." Patterson shook his head slowly. "No, Captain. What you did today went far beyond duty. You performed miracles up there. The commanding general wants to recommend you for the Medal of Honor." Brennan's exhausted mind struggled to process that information. The Medal of Honor was the military's highest decoration, reserved for valor that went beyond any reasonable call of duty. He thought about the 90 minutes of combat, about the tactical decisions made in fractions of seconds, about the 5 German pilots who would never go home to their families. The weight of what he had done settled over him like a heavy blanket. "I do not want a medal, Colonel. I want to go back to flying. Those bomber crews need protection, and there are not enough fighters to go around." Patterson studied the young pilot with something approaching reverence. "That is exactly why you deserve the medal, Captain. You are thinking about the mission, about your brothers in arms, even now. But first, you need to heal. The doctors say your shoulder took significant damage. You will be grounded for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks felt like an eternity. Brennan knew that every day he spent recovering, bomber crews were flying into German airspace with inadequate fighter protection. Men were dying because there were not enough skilled pilots to protect them. The thought gnawed at him, made the pain in his shoulder seem trivial by comparison. Over the following weeks, as Brennan underwent physical therapy and slowly regained use of his injured shoulder, the story of the mission spread throughout the 8th Air Force. Crews began calling him the Ghost of the Lightning, a reference to how he had seemed to appear everywhere, simultaneously during the fight with Richter's fighters. Other pilots studied his tactics, trying to understand how one aircraft had defeated 5 opponents while protecting 5 bombers. Riley worked 16-hour days repairing the damaged Lightning, determined to have the aircraft ready when Brennan returned to flight status. The crew chief had salvaged the torn section of boom, keeping it as a reminder of what proper maintenance and pilot skill could accomplish together. He hung it in his maintenance bay, where young mechanics could see the damage and understand that their work meant life or death for pilots. Richter survived the war, and in the decades that followed, he occasionally spoke at veterans' gatherings about his experiences. He always mentioned the mission of March 17, 1943, describing it as the day he encountered the finest tactical mind he had faced in 6 years of combat flying. The American pilot who had defeated him, Richter would say, with a mixture of respect and residual frustration, had rewritten the rules of aerial combat that day, demonstrating that superior tactics and skill could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. Brennan returned to combat 6 weeks later, his shoulder still aching in cold weather, but functional enough for flight duty. He flew 73 more missions before the war ended, accumulating 19 confirmed kills and earning the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. But he always considered the mission of March 17th to be his most important, not because of the medals or recognition it brought, but because 35 men went home to their families instead of dying over Germany. Patterson completed his required combat tour 3 months after the mission and returned to the United States, where he trained new bomber crews. He told the story of Brennan's defense of his formation to every class, using it as an example of the kind of courage and skill that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. Many of his students later flew combat missions over Europe, carrying with them the lessons of that March day when one fighter had accomplished what should have been impossible. Jen survived the war and returned to San Francisco, where he opened a small engineering firm that designed precision instruments. He never forgot the sight of the lone Lightning taking on 12 German fighters, never forgot how close he and his crew had come to death, never forgot the debt he owed to the pilot who had refused to abandon them. In 1978, when Brennan attended a reunion of Patterson's crew, Chen presented him with a handcrafted mechanical model of a P-38 Lightning, every detail perfect, every dimension exact. It sat on Brennan's desk until his death in 2006 at the age of 87. The mission demonstrated several crucial lessons that influenced American fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. First, that aggressive, decisive action by a single skilled pilot could dramatically alter the tactical balance of an engagement. Second, that bomber crews were willing to take enormous risks to support fighters that protected them, creating a mutual bond of trust and cooperation. Third, that superior technology alone meant nothing without pilots who could extract maximum performance from their aircraft under the most demanding conditions. Riley continued working as a crew chief throughout the war, eventually becoming the senior maintenance supervisor for an entire fighter group. He trained hundreds of young mechanics, instilling in them his philosophy that every rivet, every bolt, every electrical connection mattered, because pilots' lives depended on their work. After the war, he worked for Lockheed, the company that built the P-38, helping design maintenance procedures for the next generation of military aircraft. He always kept a photograph of Brennan standing beside the repaired Lightning, a reminder of what proper maintenance made possible. The ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt never fully recovered from the raid. Although the Germans attempted repairs, the damage proved too extensive and production never returned to pre-raid levels. The loss of ball-bearing production created cascading effects throughout German industry, contributing to the eventual collapse of their war machine. The 5 bombers that Brennan protected that day had accomplished their mission, striking a blow against the Nazi industrial base that paid dividends for months afterward. In the cold mathematics of war, the mission of March 17, 1943, represented an exceptional return on investment. 1 fighter aircraft, 1 pilot, 90 minutes of combat, 5 enemy fighters destroyed, 5 friendly bombers protected, 1 critical industrial target destroyed. The strategic impact far exceeded the resources committed, demonstrating the value of elite pilots operating at the peak of their abilities. But for the men who flew that mission, the mathematics meant nothing compared to the human reality. 35 men returned to England who might easily have died. 35 men eventually went home to wives, children, families who would otherwise have received telegrams expressing the nation's regrets for their loss. Brennan saved 35 lives that day, And in the decades that followed, those men lived full lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, all because one pilot refused to abandon them when the odds seemed impossible. The story of the mission spread beyond military circles in the years after the war. Historians studied it as an example of tactical brilliance under pressure. Aviation enthusiasts analyzed Brennan's maneuvers, trying to understand the physics and geometry that allowed him to defeat superior numbers. Veterans told the story to younger generations, using it to explain what courage looked like when tested to its absolute limits. Brennan himself rarely spoke about the mission, uncomfortable with the attention and accolades it brought him. When pressed by journalists or historians, he always deflected credit to Patterson for his unconventional support, to Riley for keeping the Lightning airworthy, to the bomber gunners who had created crucial diversions, to everyone except himself. This modesty, this refusal to claim glory, only increased the respect others felt for him. But late in life, when his grandchildren asked him about the war, Brennan would sometimes talk about that March morning over Germany. He would describe the clarity that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done, the absolute focus that combat demanded, the strange calculus of life and death that governed every decision. He spoke about fear, acknowledging that he had been terrified throughout the engagement, but explaining that courage meant acting despite that fear, doing what was necessary regardless of the personal cost. The grandchildren listened with wide eyes, trying to imagine their gentle grandfather as a young warrior fighting in the skies above Europe. They struggled to reconcile the quiet man who attended their school plays and baseball games with the pilot who had accomplished what seemed impossible. But Brennan wanted them to understand something crucial about that day, about all his days in combat. "I was not special," he would tell them. "I was trained well, I had good equipment, and I was given an opportunity to make a difference. What I did, thousands of other pilots did every single day. We fought not because we enjoyed it, not because we sought glory, but because stopping fascism required it. Every mission, every combat, every moment of danger was undertaken because we believed the cause was worth the risk." This perspective, this understanding that his actions were part of a larger crusade against tyranny, gave context to the mission. Brennan had not fought to become famous or to earn medals. He had fought to protect his fellow airmen, to destroy the Nazi war machine, to help end a conflict that threatened everything he valued. The mission of March 17th represented one small piece of that larger effort. 90 minutes in a war that lasted years, but those 90 minutes had mattered. The P-38 Lightning that Brennan flew that day survived the war, eventually returning to the United States where it was placed in storage. In 1992, aviation enthusiasts discovered it in a forgotten warehouse, still bearing the scars of combat. They carefully restored the aircraft to flying condition, returning it to the configuration it had carried that March day. The Lightning now appears at air shows across the country, Riley's meticulous maintenance work having given it a second life as a flying memorial to the men who flew such aircraft into combat. When the restored Lightning first flew again, Brennan attended the ceremony, then 73 years old, but still possessing the sharp eyes and steady hands of a pilot. He climbed into the cockpit one final time, feeling the familiar controls under his hands, smelling the mixture of oil and aviation fuel that had defined so much of his youth. The engines started with their characteristic rumble, and for just a moment, Brennan was 24 again, climbing into hostile skies to protect men who depended on him. The tower cleared him for takeoff. The Lightning accelerated down the runway, lifted into the air, and Brennan flew one final time, executing a perfect barrel roll over the airfield before bringing the aircraft in for a gentle landing. When he climbed out of the cockpit, tears streamed down his weathered face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming flood of memories, of brothers lost and saved, of missions flown and battles won, of a time when everything had seemed both infinitely important and desperately fragile. The mission of March 17, 1943, remains studied at military academies and flight schools as an example of what exceptional skill, courage, and determination can accomplish. The tactical decisions Brennan made that day have been analyzed by countless students trying to understand the geometry of aerial combat. His defensive maneuvers have been recreated in simulators, though modern pilots admit that reproducing his exact actions pushes both human and aircraft capabilities to their absolute limits. But beyond the tactical lessons, beyond the technical analysis, the mission endures as a story about human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. One pilot, one aircraft, facing 12 opponents while protecting 5 vulnerable bombers. The mathematics suggested defeat, the conventional wisdom said it could not be done, but Brennan refused to accept those limitations. He fought with every ounce of skill he possessed, pushed his aircraft beyond its design specifications, and accomplished what military analysts later calculated had less than a 5% probability of success. 35 men owed their lives to that 5% chance. 35 men who raised families, built careers, contributed to the world because one pilot refused to abandon them. In the final accounting, that human dimension matters more than tactical brilliance or technical prowess. Brennan saved lives that day, and those lives rippled forward through time, touching countless others in ways impossible to measure or quantify. The Fascists could not believe that one P-38 Lightning was hunting them. Their disbelief cost them 5 fighters and 1 critical factory. But more importantly, their underestimation of American resolve, American skill, and American determination to protect one another cost them the war. Brennan's mission represented in microcosm the larger conflict. Small actions by determined individuals aggregating into strategic effects that changed history. When Michael Brennan died in 2006, his funeral drew hundreds of people, many of whom he had never met. They were the children and grandchildren of the men he had protected that March day, coming to honor the pilot who had saved their fathers and grandfathers. Patterson's grandson delivered a eulogy, reading from letters his grandfather had written describing Brennan's heroism. Chen's daughter presented Brennan's widow with her father's notes from the mission, preserved for decades, describing the impossible aerial ballet he had witnessed from his bombardier's position. They buried him with full military honors, a flag draped over his casket, a 3-volley salute echoing across the cemetery. Somewhere above, a restored P-38 Lightning flew overhead, Riley's maintenance work still keeping it airborne more than 60 years after the mission. The Lightning's twin booms caught the sunlight as it performed a missing man formation with 3 other warbirds, then pulled up into a vertical climb that carried it toward the clouds, a final salute from one warrior to another. The story does not end with Brennan's death. It continues every time someone tells the tale of that March morning, every time students study his tactics, every time the restored Lightning flies at an air show. The mission lives on as a testament to what humans can accomplish when pushed to their absolute limits, when fighting for something larger than themselves, when refusing to accept defeat despite impossible odds. 90 minutes over Germany, 1 fighter against 12, 5 bombers protected, 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. The mathematics still seems impossible. The outcome still defies conventional analysis. But it happened because Michael Brennan, Crew Chief Thomas Riley, Colonel James Patterson, and 34 other men refused to accept that it could not be done. They fought with skill, courage, and determination, and they won. That victory echoes through time, reminding us that courage matters, skill matters, determination matters. The Fascists learned that lesson the hard way, 1 P-38, Lightning at a time, until their evil regime collapsed under the weight of millions of such acts of heroism. Brennan's mission was one small piece of that victory, 90 minutes in a war that lasted years, but those 90 minutes mattered. They mattered to 35 men who went home to their families. They mattered to the strategic bombing campaign that helped win the war. They mattered to everyone who believes that courage and skill can overcome overwhelming odds. And they matter still, decades later, as we remember what free people can accomplish when they refuse to surrender to tyranny. The fascists could not believe one P-38 Lightning was hunting them. Their disbelief was the last mistake 5 of them ever made.